Draft physics video. So the subject of the drag problem, back to the Feynman, you hit more raindrops. I would concede that a couple of the theories I've proposed don't work. I mean, the whole idea of the getting thinner thing, not exactly the way I wanted to say it. Maybe that's the way to say it. It's not detailed enough to be an acceptable explanation, because it doesn't explain why gravity imposes a change and why traveling through a field doesn't impose a change. So that's the real argument. I guess it's just more complicated, because in the reality there's sort of a difference between running in the rain where you're actually being affected by the rain. That is, the rain actually changes your speed, your velocity. It's a force. And then traveling through rain, let's say, where the effect is benign because of some internal circumstance where you don't feel as much rain forward as you feel from behind. And I guess I would argue that the explanation is in the fact that there's a difference between being in an unbalanced force, that is, there's less force coming from one side than the other side, and traveling through a force that's evenly balanced but you're moving through it. And the two circumstances are subtly different, and therefore there can be a mechanism where it's sensitive to one circumstance and insensitive to the other circumstance. Okay. So again, all I'm saying is, yes, I'll concede that what I've offered isn't good enough. It's not enough. I'd say the key component that is enough is the idea of this idea of a triangle, so to speak, where you spend less time. It's a more direct path in one direction and a less direct path in the opposite direction. So this opposite direction takes longer, so this ends up being more time spent going this way because of this longer line than you spend going this way. And that's what makes the difference, is that as your velocity increases, what's happening inside of the material bits is this triangle gets more, let's say this line gets longer, so you're spending more and more time with your opposite component to your circle. Let's assume that it tends to wish to be a circle. I mean, it could be a parabola, but the point is it's not a parabola, whatever. But anyway, so the point is that time can change and create a kind of gyroscope, a kind of a mechanism that balances against what you're moving into. And I would argue that this mechanism can do that if your mass is on this straight line and very little mass is on this crooked line, the return trip. Then most of your mass will have little opportunity to crash into anything, where the part going the wrong way has more opportunity because it's in the environment longer than this part is, technically. You spend more time moving bits the wrong way and less time moving them the right way, because they're moving different path lengths. Now that's complicated, so it's not a simple answer like, yeah, you have a little motor inside of the atom and it makes the thing go and it overcomes the drag. It's not a good enough, I'll concede that's not a good enough answer, because it doesn't explain why gravity still works, in the sense that you're creating less force on one side and more force on the other side. That still works. That'll still change your internal velocity, but moving through a force won't. Right. I think that's the best way to say it. It's just really about the difference between an imbalance in force, that is a rocket engine creating an imbalance, or gravity creating an imbalance, or whatever other mechanisms can do that, and a mechanism where you're just moving through a force and creating imbalance through your motion. The imbalance created by motion is time sensitive, where more time sensitive. So you have to qualify everything. Then the one where raw amounts are changed. So it's a more dramatic effect when you change the actual amount of force, and it's a less effective effect when you're moving through a force that's going the speed of light, and your speed isn't anywhere near that. But anyway, so yeah, so I have to work through more details. But the idea was the one idea I had suggested in the past was this idea of just the idea of an uneven circle, in the sense that if we could understand that force was being communicated by objects, that if you had your mass on the path of this force and no mass on these lines, that clearly more of your mass is moving in this direction than is moving in this direction. And kind of the idea of a lopsided circle in terms of the rotation, the precession. So again, the argument is that when you have a velocity, the matter is processing in the direction, and the fact that you're moving doesn't really mean you're hitting extra force from one direction than the other direction, because of the speed difference in terms of how much time you spend going in each direction is different. And so that compensates for the fact that you in net encounter more force in one direction than the other direction, because you're going to be affected less, because you're spending less time moving against the force, and you're spending more time moving with the force you're encountering. So that's the kernel of the explanation, and I will concede that I have to be more careful to stay bound to that kernel in terms of providing explanations regarding the difference. Yes, but it's going to take some. I spent all night dreaming about it. Forced it on myself. I mean, I realized last night. I said that last video was just not very good, because the explanations I provided were too distant from the fact that you need a fundamental mechanism that somehow makes a distinction between the amount of force and moving into a force, so to speak, technically. You're not really moving into the force, you're just changing the balance of the force by moving through the force. But again, it's this whole speed of light thing. The force bits are moving the speed of light in incredible speed compared to the movement speed, which is incredibly slow. And that's part of what makes this difficult to. You can't draw a picture of such dramatic differences in speed. It's impossible to illustrate that. But anyway, I'll work on it. It's my obligation to make that explanation a better explanation. So I'll work on it and make a concession that yes, I haven't provided enough of an explanation, but I would still argue that the other ways this theory fits so many things like magnetism and all the rest compensates for the weakness of this argument. And the poorness of the bent space thing is just such a poor theory. I mean, it's a God of the gaps explanation. It's just not good enough, in my opinion. Alright, so I think this is where we are comment-wise. So there's a couple of comments on this subject, so or at least one. So figure I'll read the comment. So I'll title this video 1 in the series on, we'll call it particle drag. So that's a subject that needs more. So there'll be more coming eventually. Hi Gary, in your theory, would photons that are emitted by the sun create outbound gravity pressure that would have to be countered by force bits without frequency? Sure, but you got to recognize that the light is also doing the inverse square law thing. So the amount of light hitting the Earth is tiny. I mean, 100 watts per square meter. I mean, that's pretty big. 1,000 watts. So it's not much energy at all that's actually hitting the surface of the Earth. Now, if you got closer, it would start having more and more an effect. So if you're right next to the sun, then I'm sure that the heat component coming off of the sun is going to create some pressure. But it's not going to be nearly enough pressure to overwhelm the very powerful gravitational force. So the gravitational force will be like 900 times stronger or something. It would be a lot stronger. Inbound pressure from the universe at large. In this scenario, would the sun attract the planets in spite of itself? In this scenario, would the sun attract the planets in spite of itself? See, that doesn't make any sense. You're basically saying there's a little bit of a get away from me pressure from the light, and there's come to me pressure from the gravity. You know, the net would be come to me, but it wouldn't be affected much by the amount of heat pressure. So I don't know. In this scenario, would the sun attract? No, it's just not right. Or do the outbound photons, force bits at a frequency, not create the gravity pressure effect? Thanks. Yeah. You don't confuse the two, I guess is all I can say. One's a force generated by the sun by burning chemistry. So the sun loses mass, sends photons out. The other one's, the sun doesn't lose any mass, and it's clearly an external pressure. So it's a shadowing pressure. I guess, look, the simple answer is, as much as they say gravity's a weak force, gravity's a hell of a lot stronger than light photons. Light photons don't even come close to the amount of power imposed by gravity. I mean, if you thought of magnets and you thought about how much energy it would take to push two magnets together as strong as they attract or repel, how much photon energy you would have to create to equal the amount of movement in the material bits and the amount of pressure. I mean, just think about how strong magnets repel each other, and imagine how many photons you would need to do that. So light is a tiny fraction of the energy in the universe. It's minuscule by comparison. Visible light, especially. Alright, Will E.G. So I don't know who this is, but whatever. So anyway, your reply to drag is earnest, so that's appreciated, but it violates Newton's third law. So I would argue that no, Newton's laws apply to the physical world we exist in. The nuclear world doesn't have any friction in it. It doesn't have any obligations. It doesn't have the same obligations, let me put it that way. So you can't really use Newton's laws, because in the nuclear world perpetual is actually possible, because there's no friction mechanism to steal it from you. You can have an internal force propel something. You can't have an internal force propel something forward or maintain a velocity in the face of drag. Yes, I would agree that if you still have drag, but the point is the nature of drag starts changing as you get into these little tiny bits interacting with each other, because they don't have any friction with each other. They interact in whole ways, not partial ways. They don't create any heat. They don't create any, you slowed me down thing. The interactions are all kinetic, so any unevenness created, the triangle versus the circle, could create a procession. You can't have that unless there's an exhaust. So again, I would argue that yes, there's always equal and opposite. There's always an exchange, and so anytime something absorbs stuff going this way, it means it probably somewhere has something got emitted that way. But how that happens, like in what order, in what amount of time, that's the open question. I would argue that the time equation, it can take stuff in 10 seconds and it could give it back in 3 years. So that's sort of a different argument, which would create its own slew of problems. So you can't have self-propelling engines that maintain velocity. I would argue that yes, you can. So I'm just saying, in the geometry of the universe, you can create something that's lopsided and therefore will move in space. So you say that there so say that if there were no drag force, the rocket would go faster, but that would be a violation of the conservation of energy. You can't have an internal force propel anything unless there's an exhaust. Well, again, I've never argued there wasn't an exhaust. I mean, I'm arguing that the force is converted into force coming out the sides of things. So I would argue that that's why things become kind of slick as they get velocity. You know, like airplanes and other things, the faster they go, it seems like the easier they go through the atmosphere, is because they're pushing the actual atmosphere away from them from the sides. They're creating less friction, so they're getting slipperier as they move faster. So again, I'd argue that you got to be kind of careful about making laws absolute in all circumstances, because they're not absolute in all circumstances. I think it's quite possible that something gets slipperier as it goes faster, or it gets thinner. So, well, see, I don't want to go back to that argument because it's not about getting thinner. Well, it sort of is, okay? Oh, I don't have the comments up, but you can see from this triangle, like I said, as it gets wider, it's kind of a saying that, you know, they talk about length contraction at velocity. You know, not that I'm defending anything Einstein says, but the idea isn't so much of contraction as it is things getting fatter. So I guess I would argue that with velocity things get fatter because the ratio of length, the velocity line, gets shorter, and the opposite, your velocity line, gets longer. And it can only do that by making you wider, technically, I would argue. So comments I should be showing. Sorry, you didn't get to read all the fun. Sorry, I cheated you. Anyway, you can't have put anything unless there's an exhaust. So again, I'm not saying there's not an exhaust in the first place. It all has to go somewhere. So I'm not disagreeing with that at all. So yeah, that's probably enough of a statement. I can't tell from this video, but there's a chance you're thinking force not as an acceleration, but force as a velocity. I'm merely just trying to describe how matter acquires velocity, that is, how it retains force, and how it's possible that it could travel through force without being affected because of its configuration. So it can detect imbalances in real amounts of force, but not be affected by traveling through force and creating a synthetic imbalance in the sense that you're running into more head-on force. So there's a circumstance where the head-on force has less impact, would be my argument. In fact, this is true when you talk about electrons following field lines. There's no other way to say it, but this entire explanation is just straight out of incoherent. It's straight out. This explanation is just straight out incoherent from the perspective of Newtonian mechanics. Well, again, I'm not a great defender of. It's like I stated, the inverse square law isn't a law close up. So when two things get really close, you can't do the inverse square law anymore, because all the little point sources now, some of them have the perspective of an infinite plane. From the little emitter of light from right in this middle part, from that little photons, from that emitter's point of view, as I move these two closer and closer, this begins to look like an infinite plane to this, because it can't possibly miss this. No matter what angle the light flies off at, it's going to hit this. So the inverse square law sort of breaks down close up when everything's just a little point source on a surface, when the energy isn't obeying some other rule. You know, it's coming out of the thing in the emitter's big. You know, it's not a single point source. In terms of the whole emitter isn't. The little bits inside of it that are emitting the light are single point sources. Alright, so yes, so obliging me to be coherent to Newtonian mechanics when we're talking about the nuclear interactions, I think is I think that's incoherent. If you're going to make incoherent accusations, I think that's incoherent to what we know about the nuclear world, which is it doesn't have the same friction problems. Alright. Dark matter is inferred from multiple different lines of observations. Well, I'd say it's not inferred from any line of observation that doesn't have to do with a miscalculation that is apparent in the standard model, a problem with the standard model. There's no observation that doesn't have something to do with that's not working out right, our math isn't doing that right. There's no evidence that isn't related to a problem with the standard model. Alright, galaxy rotation curves, hydrogen deuterium ratios, galaxy clustering, and lensing. Well, you have two different galaxy things in there, which again both depend on what their assumptions are about how galaxies work, and whether the mass is actually in the center of the galaxy or most of the mass is in the arms of the galaxy. And I would argue that they're not getting that part even right. Galaxies function entirely different than solar systems. The Earth doesn't have another Earth on the other side of the Sun, but galaxies do. Galaxies have mass on both sides of the center, and so in a way they don't even need the Sun to exist to rotate around each other. The arms don't need the center. Galaxies could stay together even without any mass in the center. Alright. That are all resolved by the same amount of mass. Alright, let me read that again. That are all resolved by the same amount of mass. Yes, the amount of lensing lines up with other pieces of evidence. Well, again, dark matter gets even sillier when you use it for the lensing argument. Because in the lensing argument, they're placing dark matter in locations, which makes it even more of a preposterous theory. Because now they've not only created their holy ghost, but they've said he wears a tuxedo. You know, they've added a new nuance that they can place this dark matter in discrete tiny locations, and they just happen to be in the shape of a lens. Just by dumb luck, the dark matter just happens to be in all these right locations to create a circle. You don't think that's a little bit not probabilistic? That just coincidentally they can glue little bits of dark matter in all the right locations? But see, if they put the dark matter in the center, you know, and made a big giant mass of huge focal point for the lens, you know, a huge massive lens gravity, then everything else around the universe wouldn't make sense, because there'd have to be so much gravity that everything would be shooting right into that huge giant gravity well. So they can't put the dark matter in the middle to create a lens. They have to just spread it lens shaped. So I'm just saying that's dark matter plus, and so it's even more preposterous and more obviously contrived for the purpose of fixing math. So as soon as you bring up lensing and dark matter, you're in double trouble, not just single trouble. Alright. Let's see. Yes, the amount of lensing lines up with other pieces of evidence. So again, I would argue that no, the lensing doesn't line up with anything because it's glue. It's so obviously just puzzle glue. Okay, if this were not the case, dark matter would be falsified. How do you falsify an invisible man? So I mean, this is another joke. If this is not the case, dark matter would be falsified. What, if it isn't the case that they just contrive the dark matter and place it wherever they need it? And you're saying that somehow, well, if it wasn't the case that the universe works that way, that the dark matter just coincidentally knows how to make lenses, then the theory would be falsified. Well, yes, I guess so. So I guess the point is if you think the universe knows how to make lenses on purpose for your observational purposes, so you can pretend you're bending light, fine. But I'm saying that's a ludicrous explanation of truth, or how we deduce truth. All right. If different lines of observations did not match each other, well, again, they don't have to. They don't have to match each other. When you have Invisible Man, you don't have to make anything make sense anymore, because the Invisible Man can do almost anything. I mean, yes, you can't have him in two places at once, but just about anything else is possible. I mean, once you make Invisible Man glue, there's just no stopping you. You can do it can do anything. It's not under any physical restraints. Well, not, okay, that's going too far. It's under a very minimum number of physical restraints. So obviously, I would argue that when they start placing dark matter exactly where they need it, it's kind of obvious that's glue. It's not the truth. It's just math glue. All right. Then skeptics would be right. But there are restrictions on what kinds of things you can postulate and why people want more observational data. Well, they don't seem to be wanting more observational data. They want to just make more bullshit claims about how they hear waves in space and all this other crap. So I don't see them applying any scrutiny to the question of dark matter as an acceptable rationale. The origins of it are so obviously God of the gaps. They would have never thought about it if their math worked for lensing, and if their math worked for their model of how galaxies work. So instead of concluding, well, maybe this lensing thing is bullshit because we can't bend light with magnetism, we can't bend it with any other force, why is gravity special? Maybe they just should concede that the evidence of lensing is really weak evidence. It's not where it's supposed to be. Even where it is, it's not doing all the other things it was supposed to be. Lenses have consequences. I keep pointing this out, but I mean, lenses have consequences. There's all kinds of things we should be seeing besides just seeing a couple of little reflections of my lights up there. There's all kinds of things that happen when you create a lens, and none of those things are apparent. There's no single sun that floats back a little bit away from the lens. It floats away and creates a huge giant magnified sun. Nothing like that. There's lots of reasons to think lensing is the wrong theory. Lots of reasons. So this idea that there's, the fact that you say there's no evidence, again, there's no physical evidence besides it not fitting with their God theory at all, outs you as someone who has no interest in representing others accurately. Oh, so I'm not allowed to, it's not accurate for me to say there's no physical evidence besides inconsistencies with their own theory that dark matter exists. So besides the lensing not working, the math being insane without dark matter, and besides the math of the galaxies not working without dark matter, what other reason do they believe this invisible matter exists? Is there anything else happening in the universe for which we have to blame dark matter? I would argue there is nothing else. Alright, and you're saying that I'm being inaccurate in saying I have seen no other evidence of dark matter except circumstances where the predictions of their mathematics are not seen in the real world, and therefore they need to put something new in the recipe to make their predictions correct. And dark matter, because it's an invisible man, it's a wild card. You can use it in all kinds of different ways. It can be a 3 of clubs, it can be a 9 of spades, it can be almost anything you want it to be. Yeah, it works for that reason, because it's a wild card. Alright, the point changed through, I don't know what that is. Oh, the point charged through is not about conventional science. I don't know what that means. But rather that you are using any kind of thought you can find to trash others. So again, that's, go ahead and make your accusations. You can't prove it, so go ahead and cite where I've misrepresented the theory. You say I'm misrepresenting the origins of dark matter, and I'm saying, well, how so? Show me the piece of evidence that has something to do with their predictions not being seen in the real universe. And show me one circumstance where the idea of dark matter came from some other problem than that. I'm sorry. I mean, this is just bullshit. Fuck you. That's what you deserve for this shit. But rather that you are using any kind of thought you can. So any kind. In what way? I go to such trouble. I mean, all the lensing discussions, all the discussions on the single slit. So I'm the one who's abusing the truth when they say things like single slits don't produce diffraction patterns. I'm the guilty. They're not guilty. I mean, yeah, fuck you. You can find to trash others. You're just doing that right now. No matter how unfair it may be. So again, you're claiming I've been unfair. Cite it. Cite the quotes where I've been just gratuitously unfair in my description of something. Go ahead, cite it. Cite the quotes of my unfairness. If you are agreeing that the theories don't work because of what's being proposed, I'm saying, okay, that the theory of lensing, that light is bent by photons, is not supported by strong evidence. The evidence is weak. There's lots of counterfactual circumstances existing that indicate there's a huge flaw in the theory. Now, they fixed some of them with dark matter, but they haven't fixed most of them. Most of the ones where you say, we know there's really strong gravity here, it's very clear space, and we see nothing lensed at all. So we're supposed to believe there's absolutely nothing in the universe behind that object. When everybody knows the universe has got billions and billions of galaxies and there's all kinds of shit behind that object. So why isn't any of it getting lensed? I mean, those are facts that are in contrary to the theory. I've always thought the theory was mush. And I'm saying it's mush for reasons. Okay, I connect the dots. I explain how no other force interacts with another force. There's no example of that. Nothing moving the speed of light ever interacts with anything else moving the speed of light. No evidence that that takes place in the real universe. And yet, this little tiny bit of evidence in the galaxy is supposed to make us say, well, let's screw that principle. Fuck the idea that forces don't interact with forces. We are going to use this little tiny bit of evidence where you have these blue shifted blobs in an image, and because of them, we're going to just trash the notion that force doesn't interact with force. That's what you're doing. That's your proposal of being reasonable. I'm saying I don't think that's reasonable. I'm going to stick with my side. I think my side's got it right. And you're saying you have enough evidence to be an arrogant fuck and say, no, you have to be wrong because we say so. Not because your evidence says so, right? Will you concede that the evidence is not overwhelming evidence? That it is inconsistent evidence? That the evidence says two things? Yes and no? Will you concede that? Do you also think I have to believe in wave-particle duality? You don't think there's some physical explanation that could eliminate one of those as being necessary? You don't think there's any possibility that could happen? Whatever. I mean, go ahead, be a fucking arrogant pig. But don't be accusing me of being unfair, because I don't think you can prove it. I don't think you can demonstrate it with something called evidence. Alright, anyway. If you are agreeing that the theories don't work because of what's being proposed, which I assume you do, so I'm agreeing with who that the theories don't work? Who's agreeing with me that the theories are incorrect? Whose side am I on? And I don't know I'm on somebody's side. Then you are necessarily implying that Newtonian law of gravity on large scales shouldn't work. Why would I be implying any such thing? Again, Newtonian laws are just the inverse square law, and as I pointed out quite explicitly, Newton made a huge error in saying he essentially was making the two forces interact with each other in a sense by combining the two masses in the equation, because no, the Earth imposes gravity on the Sun and the Sun imposes gravity on the Earth. They're two separate forces. Yes, you can add them up if you want to have some fun, but the truth is the Earth only feels what the Sun creates, and the Sun only feels what the Earth creates. So, man, you're just all this pigeonholing for what's your purpose again? I've made statements directly opposing any of this crap, being obligated to say I'm a Newtonian physicist or something. Where have I done that? Newton was fucking kick-ass as a scientist, and he certainly was a lot more restrained than you people, in the sense that Newton would never say something like dark matter. I mean, he would have never reached for the invisible man card. He'd just say, I don't know. Anyway, then you are necessarily implying that Newtonian law of gravity on large scales shouldn't work. Nowhere do I imply any such thing. Fuck you, liar. Because that's one of those theories you're trashing. So again, where did I trash the inverse square law? Where the fuck did I do any of that? So if you don't believe, this guy's basically saying if you don't believe in dark matter, then you don't believe in Newton's laws. Fuck you. You can't imply one statement without the other. I don't know what statement I implied. I don't know where I implied anywhere in anything I've ever said that Newton discovering the inverse square law was a wrong assumption. It was stupid. The only thing I have said is, yes, the inverse square law obviously doesn't apply to infinities. So if you get infinitely close, the inverse square law ain't going to work anymore. Very close. We won't say infinitely. I suggest you title your next video DraftScience versus Newton's laws. Why would I do that? So again, I don't even understand how you drew this bizarre fucking inference. So I'll read this last paragraph again, but I can't for the life of me understand what the fuck you're talking about. The point charged through was not about conventional science. So by conventional science, I mean modern science. I mean the one that is in authority, the authorities, the authority science. But rather that you are using any kind of thought you can find to trash others. So again, making an argument like they have the theory of light being bent by gravity wrong is finding any thought I can to trash others. To say Einstein made a mistake in terms of saying, let's turn the inverse square law into some sort of vacuum cleaner. Bend space is two-dimensional and it just doesn't work. So it's really a vacuum cleaner. So we're just going to turn mass into a vacuum cleaner, and it sucks up space. And by sucking up the space, it makes things move in the space. Because somehow the space isn't nothing, it's an ether, and it pulls the Earth because it's pulled the ether away. It's pulled the rug out from under it. Some kind of bullshit like that. To say that's wrong is just some desperate effort to blah 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 blah. To say it's a stupid analogy or a metaphor for just the inverse square law. I mean, that's all we're trying to explain is what's the cause of the inverse square law. Would you concede that that's what's at issue? What's the cause of the inverse square law? You believe the cause of the inverse square law is the fact that somehow matter consumes space-time. It compresses it in some way. I'm arguing that there's an external pressure and the inverse square law is just the exact opposite of a light bulb. Same function. Just put the light bulb in reverse. There, that's your inverse square law. The photons are coming from the outside going in, alright, and if you put stuff in between me and the light bulb, they'll shadow each other and therefore end up moving towards each other. So doing that is finding any kind of thought you can to trash others. arguing that they made mistakes is trashing. Okay. No matter how unfair it may be. So again, how was I unfair to the argument? Is bent space something else than merely a cause statement for Newton's gravity? And the cause is matter compresses a thing called space-time, and time is somehow a dimension. So we haven't even gotten to that crap. But no one can disagree with that without being accused of making ad hominem attacks. So I'm not allowed to disagree with your time dimension. And if I say I think it's wrong, I think it's a wrong understanding of the causes, I've made a personal attack. If you are agreeing that the theories don't work, okay, because of what is being proposed, okay, they don't work. I'm saying they don't work because they're not describing reality. I didn't say bent space doesn't work. I said it's not a very rational choice when you have better options to choose from. The invisible man isn't the first theory you go with. You know, first you say, hey, O.J. Simpson's wearing Bruno Magli shoes, size 14. We don't need the invisible man after all. We have a perfectly good suspect. That's what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that bent space sounds like, looks like, a God of the Gap's desperate answer to the cause. It's an undefined magical mechanism that we see nowhere else in the universe. Nothing else does this magical thing. So I'm saying, yes, it sounds like a magical explanation, not a scientific explanation. Don't work because of what is being proposed, which I assume you do. So he's saying, he assumes I'm disputing the theories. If you're not agreeing, if you are agreeing that the theories don't work, so I still don't understand who I'm agreeing with, that they don't work. You mean the actual physicists agree that their theories don't work? Well, I guess they do, in the sense they're conceding the math doesn't work, the model doesn't work, so we need dark matter because of what is being proposed. No, I think they're wrong before they propose dark matter. I didn't need them to propose dark matter to say lensing isn't the right answer. I was already against lensing before they started using invisible men, which I assume you do. Then you are necessarily implying that Newton's laws of gravity on large scales shouldn't work. So again, I just can't fucking possibly understand how you're connecting dark matter and gravitational lensing to Newton's theories. But enough. I mean, it's how much time we're going to waste on this. Yeah. So sorry. Whatever. I don't think you can back up your accusations. You're perfectly willing to try. I would appreciate it if you would try. But I think your accusations are crap. What I've argued from day one is the evidence for these theories are weak. The evidence that there's any wave or magnetic component to a photon is incredibly weak. You have to strangle photons in experiments to see any phenomenon like that. And then your assumption that the photons are doing it, rather than recognizing that your instruments that are confining the photons are creating the effect. Again, you're saying that I'm unfairly slandering physics by pointing out that it wouldn't be my first choice to jump for many universes, many worlds, or photons have radar. That wouldn't be the first thought that comes to my mind if I was to figure out what the cause was. So it's an ad hominem attack to say it looks like they just jumped at magical solutions to the problem and didn't really want to find a physical solution. Alright, nice video about quantum entanglement. Do you think this is proven or not? There's not even a hope of proof, because all of the experiments are so complex. They have so many pieces in them. And as I pointed out, with interferometers and double slits, you can't depend on physicists to understand those experiments accurately, what exactly is happening in their little black boxes. So yeah, I think it's complete rubbish that they can time photons and do all the things they say they can do. Yes, I think it's just garbage. Thanks for the explanation, Gary. It may have been brief, but it was straightforward. Appreciate it. Oh, good. All right. So anyway, so yes, I'll do some more work on this drag subject, but I don't want to spend my life on it. In my opinion, it's reasonable to assume that the two functions can be different. That the circumstance where there's less force, that is, there's two force elements on one side and only one force element on the other side, is different than when you're moving through force and it seems like you're hitting more stuff in one direction than the other, because the nuclear bits are all moving the speed of light, and that's what makes it really hard to contemplate, because we can only deal with this, not 3 million meters per second, and it's a big difference. So anyway, yeah, that'll have to do. Till next time and such, so forth and whatnot, I think. Yeah. Alright. I think that's all. Yeah, I think that's, yeah, it's enough.